Taking a taxi out to the middle of nowhere, Mexico, I wondered, where the heck am I? My friend Orion had invited me to learn a recipe from his grandmother. Little did I know she lived in a beautiful, mystical ghost town. The place is known by the locals as La Rosa, the Rose, but you can't find it on any map. I had never been someplace so rustic and yet so ironic, with ladders that lead to nowhere and a humble people who turn the nectar of majestic maguey into a frothy cactus beer that makes you forget all of your worldly woes. In La Rosa, I would come to witness sacraments to the gods of wheat and corn, and the authentic, original Mexican way of life that has all but disappeared from aspiring cosmopolitan cities. I got dropped off on the side of the road and found that a donkey was the best way to get to Grandma's house. The people of this village in the hills of southern Mexico spend most of their time growing and preparing their food. My friend's grandfather has lived on this farm for 80 years and knows everything imaginable about living off the land. He showed me his cornfields and explained to me that winter was the dry season. Summer would bring rains to turn everything green again.
¿Ya está listo? Sí, para sacar la mazorca. Ya lleva 6 meses. Wow, increíble. ¿Cuántas tortillas están en este?
Pues de estas, de unas 10 mazorcas sale 1 kilo.
1 kilo de masa.
1 kilo.
¿Y en
tamal.
¿Cuántas tortillas están en 1 kilo de masa?
Pues sí salen como unas 20.
Ok. Entonces, eso tal vez es 2 tortillas. Tenemos aquí.
Beginnings of modern-day corn were a wild grass that eventually yielded a plant known as teosinte. Teosinte is now extinct, but even if it weren't, you probably wouldn't recognize it as having anything to do with corn as we know it today. The kernels were small and much farther apart. Not until 1500 BC was corn fully domesticated to produce a large, hard kernel that could be stored for long periods to support sedentary populations. The great civilizations of Mesoamerica, the Maya, the Aztec, Toltec, Mixtec, Olmec, and others, could not have existed without corn. It formed the basis of their diet and was their most revered crop. According to the Maya, the gods mixed their own blood with corn flour to create humankind, and thus the Maya were children of the corn.
Original Americans came from Siberia 23,000 years ago. The first people to reach Americas came from Siberia, now in Russia, in a single group around 23,000 years ago at the height of the last ice age, says a new study. After reaching Alaska, they apparently hung out in the north, perhaps for thousands of years before spreading throughout North and South America. This is what a study based on genomic analysis says. The findings dispel the popular idea that Polynesians or Europeans contributed to the genetic heritage of Native Americans. The study revealed that the first people to reach Americas used a land bridge between Siberia and Alaska called Beringia.
Okay, this is Columbus's ship. It's a pretty big ship, but it's not that big because this is a model of it, and right behind it is the model of Zheng He's treasure ship, which was close to 500 feet long. And you can see that Columbus's ship was pretty small compared with it. Isn't that amazing? Let's go fly down on the deck. Take a look at it. Ooh, my. Must be where the treasure was kept. And this is where they did the drumming. Boom, 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 boom. That Zheng He's treasure ship. It was quite a bit bigger than Columbus's ship, which you see here.
Children of the corn,
ships, Tartars, and the mountains of Anahauc in the east. I want us to really understand and to realize the scale of the Mongol conquest of the Americas, that according to the historical researchers occurred in the 13th century or the late 1200s, which would explain why we see in history a very significant amount of people of Siberian ancestry appearing in the Americas a couple of centuries before the Spanish-Portuguese conquest. I want you guys to look at the ships that of the period. These are ancient Chinese ships, or illustrations of ancient Chinese ships. And as you can see here on some of these illustrations and models, that Chinese ships that sailed, they were during the days of Christopher Columbus, and particularly this one from Zheng He. And when you look at some of these ships of this period, the average vessels of these massive ships were 10 times the size of Columbus' flagships. And right here it says the Chinese explorer Zheng He's ship compared to Christopher Columbus's Santa Maria. Both lived and sailed at the same time. So as you can see from this scale model, this is, around 10 times as big as the one that Christopher Columbus came over in. So this is Zheng He's ship. Let's check out some information and see who Zheng He is. So when we look at Zheng He, we see that he was a Chinese mariner, explorer, diplomat, a fleet admiral, and court eunuch during China's early Ming dynasty. He was originally born as Mi He in a Muslim family, later adopted and conferred surname Zheng. So when we look at images of him, we clearly see that he is of Mongol, Tartar, or Siberian, Eurasian ancestry. Just looking at the phenotype, looking at some of these illustrations, some of these depictions of Zheng He. And looking at the information that they give about him, we see that he was born 1371. So you can ascertain from that he was sailing during that time, or should we say right around the time Christopher Columbus was sailing. Those were the ships that were being used during this time by Chinese. Now understand that Zheng He was born in 1371. This is after China was usurped by Genghis Khan. According to the historical researchers, in the year 1280, in the most terrible conflict by land and sea at Canton, the imperial family of Song dynasty were destroyed, on which Kublai became master of all China and the first emperor of the Zheng dynasty under the name Shi Tzu. So this is in the year 1280. Kublai, which is the grandson of Genghis Khan, became the master of all China in 1280. So now we're seeing that this Zheng He was born in 1371. So you can understand that he was born after that was already usurped by the Mongols, and pretty much the people or the population or the original people were replaced by the current people. And when we look into the historical researches of the conquest of Peru, Mexico, Bogota, Natchez, and Telemico in the 13th century by the Mongols, we see in the historical researches, we are looking up some of the sizes and the construction of these Chinese ships. Well, I wanted to point out this first. It says that from the construction of the ships, how possible it is that a great number of them might reach the shores of America. So I wanted to point that out so you can see by some of the models and illustrations how huge they were. Well, it goes on to kind of give a description. Here is talking about the ships with four masts and the construction, the size and construction of the Chinese ships. 14 ships of four masts, and some of them with a crew of 250 men. So you got to understand, these ships have four masts, and they had crews on average of 250 men. The Chinese ship have a single deck below which the space is divided into about 60 small cabins, each affording accommodations for one merchant. They have a good helm. Some of the larger ships have, besides the cabins, 13 bulkheads, or divisions in the hold, formed of thick planks, mortisized or riveted. Object of these is to guard against the springing of leaks caused by striking a rock or a blow from a whale. So, as you can see, these things were huge. Right here it goes on and says that in the Japanese annals, it relates that the Tartar general Murky appeared on the coast of Japan with 4,000 ships and 240,000 men. Keep in mind, these are the historical researchers, so these are a compilation of researchers that have been put together. It's not just by one person, it's by several historians that put together the researches that they have compiled. Of course, it may be edited by one guy who put his name on it, but the bulk and the information is shared by several historians. So the information is not just from one source, it's from several sources. So as you go through this book, you can see several different sources being cited. And this in particular one is cited that the Tartar general Murky appeared on the coast of Japan with 4,000 ships and 240,000 men. Interesting to know that. So you can see the size, and the scale of the invasions. When they were going to wherever they were going to invade, they were coming deep. Let's see who historically these Tartar people are. So, leaping into the historical researches, it says that the Tartars, when they conquered China, made regulations regarding the cutting of the hair. So right here it shows you that the Tartars conquered China, according to the historical researchers. And when you say Tartars and Mongols, well, you got to understand that these people are related. They're cousins, literally cousins. So to show you basically the relationship, you can just look at, let's look at the definition of the Mongols. Mongols are an East Central Asian ethnic group native to Mongolia and to China's Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region. They also live as minorities in other regions of China as well as Russia. So these are Mongol origins. When you look at, you see a member of a combined force of Central Asian peoples, including Mongols and Turks, who under the leadership of Genghis Khan conquered much of Asia and Eastern Europe in the early 13th century, and under Tamerlane, 14th century, established an empire with its capital at Samarkand. So you can see that Tartars and Mongols are pretty much synonymous or closely related, linked, cousins. And when you go back into the historical researches and you look and see how things, I guess, came about, as far as them becoming what we would call part of the Golden Horde, you can see that according to the historical researches, Alonzo Khan had two sons, the one called Tartar, from whom the Tartars take their name, and the other Mogul, or more properly Mongol, or Mughal, between whom he divided his dominions. So right here you can see that Alonzo Khan had two sons, twin sons, two twins sons, one Tartar, one Mughal or Mongol. This is how you know that they are related. Come from twin brothers. And when you look further into it, you see that some of the habits of these peoples are also recorded. Like right here, it says that it is well known that the Mongols and Tartars eat raw horse flesh, and the Arctic inhabitants of Asia eat raw fish. All these nations were subjects of the Great Khan. So that gives you a little history that's recorded of some of their habits. Now, when we were looking at the definition earlier, it had mentioned Turks as well as being a definition or ethnic group or ethnicity of the Tartars. Right here it goes on to show you. In 555, the Turks ravaged and subjugated great part of Tartary, and all of north of Asia belonged to this new and formidable power, who had started forth only about 10 years. So right here, you can see that in 555, the Turks conquered Tartary. And thus, when you're looking at the definition, you can see that it also has Mongols and Turks. And that's part of the reason why. Also, when you're looking into the historical researches, and you're looking at Tartars, it says that the Mongols and Tartars consider themselves as descendants of Japheth. These tribes are said, well, 7 of these tribes are said to have left the Siberia, lands of Mongolia, and came to the Americas, most by sea, but some by foot. And so I was looking into that, and it was one reference here when it was talking about the last of these Mongol tribes that arrived in Anahauc. It was the Tlascalans were the last of the 7 tribes who arrived in Anahauc. The Tlascalans, says Acosta, passed the mountains of Menad towards the east and settled in a good country. So I'm like, the mountains of Menad. I'm like, what? I've never heard of those. What are the mountains of Menad? So I started looking into it. And I found out that, well, at least that Menad meant, well, the definition was an unnaturally frenzied or distraught woman. And then when I looked at the etymology, I saw that it was from Minas, from Greek, menis, mad woman. I'm like, mad woman? Okay, so I'm like, let me look at that. So when I looked into that, of course it came back, same thing, frenzied or raging woman. And then they threw some Greek mythology stuff in it as well, but, I'm bypassing all of that, looking more into, what's more pertinent. So we see Manad means, in Greek, mad woman. And when you look at the origin, Menad, frenzied or raging woman. You scroll down to some of the etymology, then you can see word origin of Menad also means Okay. Now that got me to thinking, so if they came and passed by the mountains of Menad towards the east and settled in a good country, let me look for Mad Woman Mountains, since Menad means mad woman. So I went to look for Mad Woman Mountain. When it came up, first thing I saw was Crazy Mountains. I'm like, Crazy Mountains. So I clicked on Crazy Mountains. And first thing came up, the Crazy Mountains, often called the Crazies, are a mountain range in northern Rocky Mountains in the U.S. state of Montana. Montana. So, that got me to thinking. If they came from, say, the Bering Strait through Alaska and Canada, then we would look and see on a map look, it's simple. They can come across, come through Alaska, come through Canada, there's Montana. And there's the Mad Woman Mountains, or the Crazy Mountains. Right here. Go back, let's look at another. Okay, here we have another illustration, and as you can see, the Crazy Mountains, often called the Crazies, are a mountain range in northern Rocky Mountains in the U.S. state of Montana. In Montana. So that got me just thinking of a route if they came by land. Some came by sea, some came by land. The majority came by sea, some came by land. So if some came by land, then they crossed the Bering Strait, and we're not talking about 15, 23,000, 30,000 years ago. We're talking about the 13th century. We talk about a few hundred years ago, so of course we know that they could have came their route. So according to the historical researchers, this is when a lot of them started arriving. Majority of them came by boats, fleets of them. And I'll show you the sizes of those boats. So that's what they were coming in. And you can see that the majority of those boats were being manned by 250 people. Just imagine, and then they had all of those 60 compartments. So, it was ample space and room to accommodate a lot of people, to bring them over here. So you thinking about 250 for your crew, and you can possibly put another 200-300 on that, to bring with you. So those who came by foot, they migrated through Alaska, and according to the historical researchers, they stayed in these regions, Alaska and Canada. So now we understand that a lot of them during this period, they came and migrated into the northern plains of North America, into Montana, if he passed by the mountains of Menad in the east. This is east. So as we can see, if they are over here coming, this will be east. And this would be a pathway. Lead right to the Rocky Mountains, or this section of the Rocky Mountains is called the Crazy Mountains. or the Med Woman Mountains, or the Mountains of Manad of the East. So I wanted to bring that out so you could see how some of these things tie together. And we have to really understand that the majority, the bulk of them, migration into the North American plains was in the mid to late 1400s for those who settled in North American plains, for those tribes who were what we call the Plains Indians. A lot of them settled, according to the conquistador records, a lot of them settled around the mid 1400s, late 1400s. They start coming out of Canada into the northern plains of America. Now we have another account of them also coming by ships and invading Peru, Mexico, Bogota, Natchez, and Telemico in the 13th century, which would be the late 1200s. So around the same period of time. And as recorded, it was 7 tribes. So now we understand why there are a significant amount of them in these regions now, and how all of a sudden it happened. And when you're looking back in history, you can see that all of a sudden, around a certain period of time, say the late 1200s, early 1300s, you start seeing them more so involved in the histories of the Americas, being more so depicted in the history of the Americas. These are in the codexes. You can look at the older codexes and you can see, you don't see none of them. Then you see some of the more recent ones or the later ones, then you start seeing them being, involved in some of the pictures or some of the depictions. And then gradually, as it got until the, say around the time the Spaniards came over, or as when they were going about re-illustrating or rewriting or redoing a lot of those manuscripts that were destroyed or had burnt, because a lot of the information was being destroyed by the Spaniards and the Portuguese. They were destroying it. They thought it was pagan, so they were burning it. But some of it was saved, and some of it that was saved or salvaged was basically reproduced. And some of those reproductions reflected the modern people that we see over there more so now than the original people. But when you see some of the older ones, some of the more original ones, then you can see who the original people look like. Well, they are also depicted in the murals of Banapac Temple in Mexico, or Anahauc. So there are signs and there are a lot of artifacts that are left behind to remind you who the original people of the land was. And now you can wake up and realize who they still is. And we also got to understand the relationship of the Mongols and the Tartars and how they are first cousins, related. Mongols and Tartars in the area that they both inhabited. Russia, Asia, Europe, Eastern Europe. When we look back and see some of the things that the Tartars are recorded in history, you can see, for instance, the Tartars actually, once they were conquered by the Turks, that they became what was known as the Sioux Mongols. And according to the historical researchers right here, it says that the Tungusi, which is what they were called, when they settled, lost the name of Tartars and were called Sioux Mongols or water or lake Mongols. So now you see that these were also people that were, navigating ships. To be called water or lake Mongols, you have to be in the water of the lake. So that kind of explains when you look at how they showed up. Right here where it says that the Tartar general Muku appeared on the coast of Japan with 4,000 ships and 240,000 men. So you can see the Tartars were, how they were rolling. And how Tartars and the Mongols, basically as being first cousins, related, blood related, they just descend from twin brothers. So you can see that they're blood related. So they're synonymous. So we have to understand when they say Mongols came over, now it was Mongols and Tartars. It was both of them. It was the cousins coming over here together. Same thing when the Spanish and the Portuguese came over, or the Suave and the Visigoths. They're cousins. Same thing. And all of them are related. All of them are cousins. From the tribes of Alemanni, Gog and Magog. So now this is what we're dealing with. And then prophecy being fulfilled.
They called their babies maize blossoms, and young girls wore tender green ears. A warrior in his prime was known as Lord Corncob.
Looking at these pictures, you would think that, oh, these people, they've been around this all their life. They know maize, they know how to grow it and cultivate it. And, oh, these are people responsible for getting all different types of variations of corn, and they done cultivated so much that bull. These people know not. They knew nothing until the 13th century about this crop. Nothing. This is what they know. These are the images of Siberia. This is what they know. This is what they come from. From the plains, from the steppes of Siberia. These are the crops that they knew. Corn doesn't grow here. Wheat and barley and cabbage, peas, buckwheat. These people never saw this until they came here. These are the crops from which they came. This is what they know. This is their habitation historically.
Basan Hu still lives in a traditional Mongolian ger, or yurt, but she's given up her old nomadic life. For the past year, her ger has been based in just one place, in one of the sprawling shanty towns surrounding the capital, Ulaanbaatar. Like many people living here, Basan Hu used to raise animals on Mongolia's steppes, but that life is growing harder and harder because of economic pressures, environmental changes, and a string of devastating winters that killed off huge herds of livestock a decade ago. Since then, hundreds of thousands of nomadic herders have packed up and moved here to look for work. Basan Hu came to the city to live with two of her sons after her husband died. She gets a $50 a month pension, and one son has found construction work, so the family is getting by. But she admits that if her husband were alive, he never would have agreed to leave the countryside and their old way of life.
Ой, тэр нараад сэгшмэн дээр юм тийм. Бодлого өсөөр хавийнхаа мал сага тийм ээ. Тэцгагийн наваад. Тэгээд амтрууд хөдөөнөрөө дээр юм уу гэж готод чинь тэгэл.
Life on the city's outskirts is not easy, but it's become a typical way of life for Mongolians. With the influx of migrants like Basanku and her family, Ulaanbaatar's population has ballooned. Makeshift houses and gers now fill what used to be grassland. Now more than half of the people in the capital, or 1 in every 5 Mongolians, live in these suburban ger districts without basic sanitation or infrastructure. There are some signs of improvement here. One kindergarten is being built with Japanese aid. The World Bank funds clean water projects, and residents can apply to own the land where they've settled. But unemployment is high, and conditions are particularly bad in winter, when the air is full of thick smoke from the homes heated with burning coal and garbage. This is another force that's reshaping Mongolia. The mining industry is booming. Foreign and Mongolian firms dig for coal, copper, uranium, and gold, like here at the Canadian-owned Boro gold mine. For Mongolians struggling to make a living off the land, these jobs are a godsend. At Boro, miners earn $800 a month, compared to an average $60 in construction work. But there are far more Mongolians seeking work than there are mining jobs. In Sunkhara, a town whose economy was badly hurt during the privatization rush of the 1990s, some of the urban poor have turned instead to illicit mining, alongside former herders from the countryside. These so-called ninja miners dig for gold with minimal tools and no official rights to the land. One NGO here is working to help the ninja miners form collectives and adopt safer mining practices. An employee, Tuya Damdimjants, explains why so many people have gone into this risky line of work, including her husband, Batur Tene. Their family's entire herd died in the harsh winter of 1998.
Тэгээд үнэхээр ямар ч орлогогүй болоод ирэхээр төв суурин газар хөд манайх ч одоо эндээс 20 км-ийн санаас төв суурин газар бараадаа л тэгээд тэр өрхийн тэр үр хөвгтэй тийжих хэвээр юм чинь өөр тэр хүнд энд орж ирээд нөгөө ажилгүй 20 хэдэн хүн дээр 20 мянган хүн дээр дахиад нэг хүн нэмэгдээд ороод ирж байгаа юм чинь ажлын байр авахгүй тийм учраас алтанд явж эхэлсэн 1999 оны намар явж ирсэн.
At the end of a long dirt road about 3 hours north of Ulaanbaatar, ninja miners have set up a gold mining camp. They can expect to earn $5 or $10 a day for back-breaking work in the pits or for trying to isolate the gold using dangerous chemicals like mercury and cyanide. Ironically, the mining industry, a last recourse for many former herders, is only making it harder for those who still raise animals for a living. Both official and unofficial operations use huge amounts of water, diverting rivers and leaving large stretches of pasture land unusable. Once this site is depleted, the ninja miners will break camp and look for gold elsewhere. It's a new kind of nomadic life, and one that offers no more certainty than they had before. At White Lake, Sagan Nur, outside the city of Darkhan, it's horse branding day. The Buddhist calendar says it's an auspicious day to tame animals, and men from 3 families are pitching in with the hard work. They all live in a more or less traditional way here, raising livestock and moving to different pastures throughout the year. Even with all the migration to the cities, some 40% of Mongolians still live as nomadic herders. But for Dolgor Ma and her family, life has changed too. They moved here, near the city, from remote Gobi Altai province, because they were too far from any markets. And that's another trend for many of Mongolia's herders, who can only keep making a living if they adapt to the changing economy. Living near a city, Dolgor Ma's family now gets twice the price for their camel's milk, and her son, Shinbayar, can go to school nearby in Darkhan. And that might mean a better future for him.
Гэхдээ сургууль соёл дамжсан л дээр үстэй малчин. Малчин тэгэлэр баталгаа тийм биш тийм.
But that's no longer guaranteed in a changing Mongolia, where urban life and mining are steadily replacing rural life. For now, at least, this family is able to keep its traditions alive, and Shinbayer's future seems wide open.
The Gobi is an extreme arid desert covering a third of Mongolia. Traversed by ranges of sand dunes constantly lashed by the wind, the first European to cross it was the Italian traveller Marco Polo in 1275. With temperatures of up to 50 degrees centigrade in summer, which generally fall to 40 degrees below zero in winter, life in the Gobi is harsh and difficult. With the arrival of summer, the nomads of the desert card the wool to make felt canvases which will protect the ger during the long, cold winter months. It is also a good time to collect and store camel excrement. These animals are essential if man is to survive in these barren deserts. In a landscape where there is not even a single tree, this is the only possible source of energy for heating and cooking. Without it, life here would be impossible. But every year with the summer storms, the Gobi gives a brief respite to its inhabitants, and for a few weeks the miracle of nature returns to the desert, covering everything with a fresh green blanket of grass. Water once more runs between the dunes and is thirstily absorbed by the parched, cracked land, and the Gobi again comes to life. What until just a few days ago was simply stone and dust now takes on the appearance of a lush garden with all the variety of greens you could possibly imagine. The storks stop off here to regain their strength on their way to the cooler lands of the north, while in the Guramban Saikan Muru mountains, the almost exclusive domain of wild goats and scavengers, the ibex descend from the summits in search of food. Wherever it is possible, grass grows and the Gobi is transformed from an extreme arid desert into an incredible, almost surrealist landscape. Everyone wants to take advantage of this gift of nature while it lasts, and the desert is populated by humans and animals from the high steppes which surround the Gobi. In a country where 60% of the population are nomadic cattle breeders, with over 35 million head of cattle, fresh pasture is the most precious commodity of all, and each family will try to lead its herds to the best places. But here the camel continues to be king. It is by far the most valuable animal for the nomads, and has been used by traders and travelers since antiquity. For these ruminants, now is the time to store energy, and their erect humps are evidence of this, an unmistakable sign that they are well fed. If they do not work, they can go for up to 10 months without drinking water, living on their accumulated reserves and losing up to 25% of their weight without suffering any consequence, because the water they lose is only from their body tissues and not from the blood, so the heart does not have to make any additional effort. For over 80 years, the Tenzin family has moved to this region every summer with their 200 horses, 800 sheep and goats, and 200 cows. They continue to be prosperous cattle breeders despite the fact that 2 years ago a particularly harsh winter killed over half of their cattle. The Tenzin live in a camp composed of 4 gers, the traditional shelter perfectly adapted to the needs of nomadic life. It is cheap, large, can be put up and taken down very quickly, it is easy to transport, robust, cool in summer, and warm in winter. The gers always face south and the entrance is painted in bright colors to ward off evil spirits. Inside, the stove, which also serves as heating, stands in the center, and around it the beds, a few pieces of furniture, and most of all the Buddhist shrine. Obviously, the base of their diet is meat, especially lamb. Milk is also an important ingredient of their diet. From it, they produce at least 12 different products, including arag, a drink they make only in summer from fermented mare's milk. This is very healthy and helps combat tuberculosis. They also drink agi, an alcohol made by distilling cow's milk, which they have been making for thousands of years. While the women remain inside the gers, taking care of the home, the men get ready for one of the favorite activities of these nomadic herdsmen, breaking in the colts born the previous spring. Under the direction of Ninten Pasara, the chief of the clan, the riders round up the horses, trying to make sure the untamed colts are trapped in the center so they can be caught using a pole. The Mongols never mark their horses or give them names. They distinguish them by their color and have over 200 words to differentiate them. For them, the horse represents much more than simply an animal used for transport and carrying goods, which they began to tame 4,000 years before Christ. Small, fibrous, and incredibly resistant, with great strength, greatly out of proportion to their size, these horses were key in enabling Genghis Khan to create such a powerful army. The chronicles tell us that the soldiers slept on their mounts while they continued to travel through the night. When food was scarce, they even drank the blood of their horses. At the other side of the country, beyond the desert and the infinite steppes, along the border with Siberia, a vertical world rises up, dominated by taiga. Taiga is a Russian term for the northern forests composed of firs, larches, and silver birches, perfectly adapted to the strong winds and the low temperatures. We are in one of the most remote areas of Mongolia. Here there are no roads and settlements are connected only by the paths trodden by the nomads. At the end of the summer, the meltwaters from the mountains cover the majority of the surface of valleys and grasslands, making it extremely difficult to move the cattle from one place to another. For the Dahat, the inhabitants of these lands since the days of Genghis Khan, it is time to transfer the herds from the highlands to less demanding regions where they will spend the autumn. The Dahat can move up to 15 times a year in search of more fertile pastures or places where the wind is less fierce. In winter, however, when grass is scarce, the families must separate and search for food independently. The only boat raft still remaining since the Russians left cannot carry all their cattle from one side of the river Tsangan-Nur to the other. But here time is not important, and while they wait, they chat and drink tea. If they cannot cross today, then they'll do so tomorrow.
These people know not. They knew nothing until the 13th century about this crop. Nothing. This is what they know. These are the images of Siberia. This is what they know. This is what they come from. From the plains, from the steppes of Siberia. These are the crops that they knew. Corn doesn't grow here. Wheat, wheat and barley and cabbage, peas, buckwheat.
Another type of business supported by the Mongol Derby is funding vegetable cultivation. Mongol Derby funds currently support 2 vegetable farming businesses. This type of business is especially valuable to local communities as vegetables are scarce in Mongolia, relying on imports from China. Anahauc started his business in 1992. He applied for a Mongol Derby grant to expand his planting area, resulting in increased production of vegetables for his local community in Eden Sansum, Tuv Aimag. His entire planting area is used permanently. The field is strategically located right next to the Urt River, providing ample irrigation. They also have 30 tons of storage capacity for storing and preserving the vegetables throughout the year. As part of the project, they will purchase new equipment, including a potato harvester, a generator for their irrigation pump along with a sprayer and tubes, and install insulation in the storage facility.
Одоо ерөнхийдөө бол жоо хөрөнгөний дэмжлэг хэрэгтэй байдаг. Тэрнээс бол бусдаар бол гайгүй. За бид одоо 2011 онд Мексикоор Монгол олон улсын байгууллагаас хэрэгжүүлж байгаа төсөлд хамрагдаад ажиллаж байна. Тэгээ энэ төсөлд хамрагснаар бид одоо урд нь 3 га газар хүнсний ногоо тариалдаг байснаа 5 га болгож өргөжүүлээд эргэн тойрон барьсан энэ ногооныхаа хашааны төмөр утсыг нь одоо цоог нь нэмэгдүүлж мал орох боломжгүй болгосон. Нэгдүгээрт, хоёрдугаарт бол бид нар сумын төвдөө ногоо хадгалдаг зойроо доторсон банзаар тэгээд одоо энэ бидний ард ажиллаж байгаа энэ Японы Honda мотортой энэ услгааны бороожуулах төхөөрөмжийг худалдаж авсан. Одоо бид бас төмсний ухагч худалдаж авсан байгаа.
Now I'll shut up for a second so you can hear what Mexico used to sound like. All of Mexico used to sound like this, like families working together to prepare the corn for the evening meal of plump tamales or fresh, hot off the grill tortillas.
Maize, known in some English-speaking countries as corn, is a large grain plant domesticated by indigenous peoples in Mesoamerica in prehistoric times. The leafy stalk produces ears which contain the grain, which are seeds called kernels. Maize kernels are often used in cooking as a starch. History. Most historians believe maize was domesticated in the Chihuahuacan Valley of Mexico. The Inca and Mayans cultivated it in numerous varieties throughout Mesoamerica, cooked, ground or processed through nixtamalization. Beginning about 2500 BC, the crop spread through much of the Americas. The region developed a trade network based on surplus and varieties of maize crops. After European contact with the Americas in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, explorers and traders carried maize back to Europe and introduced it to other countries. Maize spread to the rest of the world because of its ability to grow in diverse climates. Sugar-rich varieties called sweet corn are usually grown for human consumption as kernels, while field corn varieties are used for animal feed, various corn-based human food uses, and as chemical feedstocks. Maize is the most widely grown grain crop throughout the Americas, with 332 million metric tons grown annually in the United States alone. Approximately 40% of the crop €130 million tons is used for corn ethanol. Genetically modified maize made up 85% of the maize planted in the United States in 2009. The first corn plants only grew small, 1-inch-long corn cobs, and only one per plant, but artificial selection by the indigenous people of the Americas made it to grow several cobs per plant, and usually several inches long each time. Words for maize. The word maize derives from the Spanish form of the indigenous Torno word for the plant, maize. It is known by other names around the world. Corn outside North America, Australia, and New Zealand means any cereal crop, its meaning understood to vary geographically to refer to the local staple. In the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, corn primarily means maize. This usage started as a shortening of Indian corn. Indian corn primarily means maize, but can refer more specifically to multicolored flint corn used for decoration. In places outside North America, Australia, and New Zealand, corn often refers to maize in culinary contexts. The narrower meaning is usually indicated by some additional word, as in sweet corn, corn on the cob, popcorn. Cornflakes, baby corn. In southern Africa, maize is commonly called Mela or mealie. Maize is preferred in formal, scientific, and international usage because it refers specifically to this one grain, unlike corn, which has a complex variety of meanings that vary by context and geographic region. Maize is used by agricultural bodies and research institutes such as the FAO and CSIRO. National agricultural and industry associations often include the word maize in their name even in English-speaking countries where the local, informal word is something other than maize. For example, the Maize Association of Australia, the Indian Maize Development Association, the Kenya Maize Consortium and Maize Breeders Network, the National Maize Association of Nigeria, the Zimbabwe Seed Maize Association. However, in commodities trading, corn consistently refers to maize and not other grains.
People of African descent go back hundreds of years in Mexico, but as a group, Afro-Mexicans are largely invisible. A 2015 census is changing that. CCTV's Frank Contreras has insight from Mexico's southern state of Oaxaca.
Among Afro-Mexican communities here on the Pacific coast of Mexico's Oaxaca state, this dance is symbolic. Locals say the devils represent the growing power of African descendants in this part of Latin America. It's a history that's beginning to gain global attention. The presence of Africa here in Oaxaca state is one of the lesser known aspects of the vast cultural diversity in this region, one of the most culturally diverse in all of Latin America. Last year, for the first time, the government conducted an interim census asking Mexicans, based on your culture, history, and traditions, do you consider yourself black, meaning Afro-Mexican or Afro-descendant? And nearly 1.4 million people responded, yes. Afro-Mexican communities exist here in Oaxaca state's Costa Chica region, the neighboring state of Guerrero, and Veracruz state, among others. An Afro-Mexican leader from Pinotepa Nacional says, as a nation, Mexico is much more than just a mixture of Spanish and indigenous people.
We believe that the whole world should know that in the colonial era, Mexico was an entry point for African slaves. Our ancestors were forcibly brought here under slavery.
But images of African descendants in Mexico rarely appear in public. The exception is this famous comic book character, Memín Penguin, which was created in the 1940s. Nicomedes Ramirez and her cousin, Castula Silva, grew up in these impoverished coastal communities. Ramirez says over the years, politicians have come with their election year promises to end poverty.
They told us they would help, and they would bring us basic things we were lacking. All we had to do was ask, but so far, they have done nothing for us.
I never went to school because when I was a girl, there was no school here. We had to go to another community, and my parents, may they rest in peace, told me I could not go, so I never studied.
Afro-Mexican communities are almost completely separated from the rest of Mexico, and very few outsiders ever come here for a first-hand look at their most well-known traditions, like this dance known as a chilena, or this one depicting a charging bull. Mexico's national constitution is the only one in Latin America that does not specifically mention the existence of citizens of African descent. Afro-Mexican authorities say they're planning to take legal action and change the constitution so that it includes them.
By having no presence in the Mexican Constitution, there is no public policy that protects our rights and necessities. We, as Afro-Mexicans, like many indigenous Mexicans, live in regions of extreme marginalization.
Constitutional recognition would finally give them access to medical services, educational grants, and Social Security benefits. For now, Afro-Mexicans, whose descendants came from places like Kenya, the Congo, and later the Caribbean, still do not enjoy these basic rights.
One possible article of export we examine as closely as opportunities would allow, namely the Indian inhabitants, that they are, in every respect, the right article for trade. Brown-skinned and capable of defending themselves, strong, healthy, and industrious. And the creeks and mangrove swamps of Cuba only 3 days sail off the plantations and mines that want 100,000 men to bring them into full work and swallow Aborigines, Chinese, and Negroes indifferently, meaning it don't even matter. Anything that has a dark skin and can be made to work would take those Yakutus in any quantity. Yakutus is people from Yucatan.
estas danzas son del noroeste de África. Nosotros elegimos esa región porque nos dimos cuenta a través del internet, a través del internet. A través del internet, que los esclavos que fueron extraídos de allá, hasta acá a nuestro pueblo, Acoyantes, y entonces empezamos a indagar y retomamos esas danzas. Seguimos bailando porque intentamos dar a conocer nuestra cultura y a través del baile nosotros pretendemos invitar, atraer a los jóvenes para que se unan a nosotros y así consolidar nuestra cultura, consolidar nuestra propia identidad como pueblo negro.
Now, when people think of American slavery, they don't think of the enslavement of Native Americans. Why is this?
Well, partly because the enslavement of Native Americans occurred first. And
say that again, please. Say that again.
The enslavement of Native Americans really began before the enslavement of Africans. Not only in the Caribbean by the Spanish, where it was extremely extensive. And in the Caribbean, I might mention that the numbers were huge that were involved, and they had several kinds of slaves. They had the normal slave, but they also had people who were called, they were called Indians from the useless islands. They were from islands where there was no gold. And so they had the right to go and remove people from those islands.
The useless islands?
Yeah,
what
well, Jamaica, for example, would be a useless island. Because it had no gold. Inutiles, not useful. And they needed labor so badly on Haiti, where the gold was found, Haiti, and Cuba, that they were stealing people constantly and removing them by force from other islands. Even after it was no longer technically in the best or possible, legally even, to enslave, they still could remove them as forced free labor. We could call it later coolie labor, right? And then they had other categories of unfree Indians as well. But once the population declined on the islands themselves, they began raiding the north coast of Venezuela and Colombia very extensively, also part of Panama. They also came up here and cleaned out the Bahamas completely. All the Lucayo people.
What period are we talking about now?
Well, we're into the 1440s, 1540s, 1560s. Many people from Florida, South Carolina is raided for slaves. And also the west coast of Mexico in the 1530s. Many Mexican Indians are sold as slaves. And also the west coast of Mexico in the 1530s. Many Mexican Indians are sold as slaves. And also the west coast of Mexico in the 1530s. Many Mexican Indians are sold as slaves.